Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 10th annual Louis L. Odette Family Lecture at St. Michael's Hospital. I'm Dr. Karen Shin. I'm the head of psychiatry at St. Michael's Hospital. This annual lecture brings together the world's foremost experts to explore the pressing issues related to homelessness, housing, and health. The topic this year, Indigenous Peoples and Housing, Restoration and Respect, is an especially timely one. Canada's history and culture of systematic colonization and violence has left deep scars and lasting effects on residents of this land. As a result, Indigenous peoples experience complex and higher than average rates of mental health conditions and physical health challenges. This is all made worse by substandard housing and homelessness. Addressing this is an urgent issue for all of us. And how we can address this and redress these issues is a challenge that we will listen and hear about tonight. Thanks to our keynote speaker, Professor Suzanne Stewart, our expert panelists, Professor Lynn Lavallee and Dr. Rennie Linklater, and also Roberta Pike and Wesley Rayome. And to all of you for joining us here in person or online. And especially a thanks to the Odette family, pioneers in Canadian philanthropy and establishing this lecture series. As a settler, it's really important to start off this gathering with a land acknowledgement, especially in the company of our Indigenous members, our keynote speaker, our panelists, and other members in the audience. Unity Health Toronto acknowledges that the land in which we live, work, and operate on, Takaronto, is part of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant territory and is the traditional and ancestral lands of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat nations. It is land as part of Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit in 1787, and the Toronto Purchase 1787, 1805, and 2010. It is still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. By acknowledging the land, we acknowledge our treaty responsibilities in sharing this land and to the Indigenous people who have been the traditional caretakers of this land since time immemorial. I want to take some time and actually reflect more on this meeting place tonight. St. Michael's Hospital, affiliated with the University of Toronto, two Eurocentric institutions that still need change to achieve decolonization and respectful partnerships with Indigenous peoples. Established differences in power have entrenched inequities for Indigenous peoples, such as in health and housing, key topics for our event. Tonight, we've come to learn from several Indigenous leaders to listen and engage in thoughtful dialogue. The purposes of improving health, relating to others with empathy, building stronger communities, and advancing learning are common elements towards reconciliation. My responsibility in giving this land acknowledgement tonight started my commitment to learning, reflecting on my relationship with Indigenous peoples and strengthening my commitment for change. My words need to have authenticity, and to achieve this, I had to learn the meaning of what I was saying. To begin with, I had to learn something as simple as the meaning of dish with one spoon. It made me realize how many times I might have heard a land acknowledgement without truly understanding. Tonight is a place of sharing, and I'd like to share a little of what I've learned. A dish with one spoon is an agreement grounded in Indigenous tradition. Aptly, it describes sharing. The sharing of territory between two groups who take responsibilities for the land and the lives and the animals that share that land. This rich metaphor invites us to imagine a dish holding the resources to be shared and a spoon as a joint utensil for all gathered around. Using a spoon is symbolic. There are no knives, no forks, no instruments to poke, prod, or cause harm. Only a spoon, a peaceful tool, a tool that can be filled for communal use. I'll end by challenging other settlers like myself to make a commitment to learn about the land that you are being invited on, gain knowledge for change and action, and work towards equitable sharing of power and resources. I make a commitment in my role as head of the Department of Psychiatry and being part of St. Michael's Hospital and Unity Health to work on listening and learning how to improve healthcare services for Indigenous populations. It's a commitment to create more equitable healthcare and being flexible in ways that lead to better balances in partnerships than in the past. One dish, one spoon. I really see these as wise words to live by. So before we bring out our keynote speaker to the podium, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tim Rutledge, the President CEO of Unity Health Toronto, the network that St. Michael's Hospital is part of, to say a few more words. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shin. That was quite a thoughtful and acknowledgement. And thank you for the introduction. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Michael's Hospital. I am so pleased to be here with you and thrilled that so many members of our community have joined us in person and virtually for this Louis L. Odette lecture. The focus for this year's event is public discussion about Indigenous peoples and housing, which is clearly an incredibly important topic, and I'm sure it will be an enlightening. And we're honored to host this conversation here at St. Michael's Hospital. Our hospitals were founded on a commitment of providing the best possible care experiences to people experiencing disadvantage. Unity Health cares for more First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people than any other healthcare organization in the GTA. In a recent 5-year period, nearly 14% of patients admitted to one of our inpatient units were Indigenous. In the period between 2016 and 2018, nearly 14% of patients, nearly a quarter of the estimated 70,000 Indigenous adults in the GTA visited the St. Michael's Emergency Department. Equity is a key dimension of quality, and as we see it, it is an important responsibility to remove barriers to healthcare and ensure that we provide culturally safe and competent care for all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis patients, residents, and community members. With that obligation comes a commitment to doing better. Earlier this year, Roberta Pike, who is on today's panel, joined Unity Health as the inaugural Director of Indigenous Wellness, Reconciliation, and Partnerships. The establishment of this role is but one step in our work to advance health and reconciliation across our organization. Under Roberta's leadership, we are committed to creating an Indigenous health strategy to guide our efforts to improve Indigenous health outcomes and care, improving human resource strategies to advance the recruitment of Indigenous peoples across Unity Health, and developing tools, responses, and opportunities for staff to improve Indigenous cultural safety. We are working with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis leaders and community members to make sure our work aligns with the needs of Indigenous communities. Our approach is rooted in partnerships, respect, and reconciliation. And it is in that spirit that this evening's lecture and discussion are being held. So once again, many thanks to all of you for being here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our panel members for their personal introductions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So this is where I get to start stick handling. My name's Emily Matthew. I'm a journalist who spent quite a few years dabbling my toes in the housing sphere. And it's been my enormous pleasure to moderate this panel for 4 years. So thank you to the Odette family for inviting me back. Today, before Dr. Stewart gives her keynote, we thought we would invite our guests up to spend a few minutes introducing themselves. So I'll just invite them now to come up and place in the comfy blue chairs at the front. And let us learn a little bit more about you. And then we'll return after for the Q&A.
Good evening. My name is Wesley Rayom. I'm from the Eagle Lake First Nation, which is outside of Dryden, Ontario. I was adopted out when I was 5, moved to Sudbury till I was 18, and experienced homelessness before that. And then, due to certain circumstances, well, I'll explain later on, I experienced homelessness for quite a few years, and I've been housed now for 8 years, consistently living at the same address. And again, I'll speak to the reason for that later on. And there is an agency that's helped me a lot. And again, I'll speak more about that later on. So I just wanted to introduce myself as Wesley Rayom. I have a spirit name, and that is Joshua M.K. Panas, which was given to me by an elder, Jake Agoni, and it translates to Blue Thunderbird. They,
Miigwech, Wesley, Ojosh Kumbanis, Buju, Ojosh Kumbanis, Dishnakaz, meanwhile, Manituma Constitution Kazak, Manitou Bontagona Dunji, Negictodem, Nedema Tiktodem. Good evening, everyone. My English name, I should say, is Rennie Linklater. And as I introduced myself, I actually felt incredibly warm and this huge light filling my heart, because this is the first time in my life that I've sat beside someone who shares the same Anishinaabe name as me. My name is also translates to Blue Thunderbird or Josh Kombanes. So I feel this connection in this circle already in being here. And I'm from Manitou Rapids, also known as Rainy River First Nations, which is in northwestern Ontario in the traditional territory of Treaty Number 3. And both of us also come from Treaty 3. And so it's amazing when we find ourselves in these spaces, because I'm reminded that relationship is everything. Relationship with ourselves, with each other, with our friends and family, with the universe, and all that exists within creation. And so today, I just want to say Chief Wetch for to be part of this panel this evening. I also I come from a long line of experience myself, and was also part of the 60s scoop. And got attended 4 months old in Southern Ontario, raised by a Ukrainian family. As I came through those experiences, what some of my purpose was. I found myself working not only in political politics, but eventually in healing, because I came to learn what it was that people could really help each other with in terms of our own wellness. And so today I hold the position of Senior Director of Strawberry McCall, which is a Center of Innovation at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And I just want to say that I'm really honored to sit with wonderful people today, and with as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie and Renee. Nowadays, Gijago Kwe Deshnakas, Wapajeshi Dodem Bekanondon Jaba. My English name is Roberta, and my spirit name translates to Center Heart Sky Woman. And for me, it is living out, I think, my life to the point where I'm finally coming into my name. My name is about leadership, and it's about leading with the heart and the mind being centered and working properly in cohesion. I have worked in Toronto's Indigenous community for many, many, many years in different areas and spheres. Initially as a social worker, and now I find myself here at Health Toronto as the first director, Indigenous wellness, reconciliation, and partnerships, which is a huge, huge feat, and it's a lot of work. I feel very honored to be in this position, and I hold the responsibility very carefully in front of me. I'm honoring all of the individuals, the families, and the community for their care and their love, and I want to do the best that I can to support everybody. The Indigenous community is my family, and I pledge that in the work going forward, I see each individual person as a family member, and that's the kind of love and care that I want to put forth. And that's it for me. Miigwech.
Bonjour, Minadidime Quaindish Nakaz, Wawashkijin Dodam, Sudbrin Dijabanish, Nabi Miti Quaindao. I'm Lynn LaValle, and I want to thank everybody for coming and also thank Dr. Suzanne Stewart for inviting me and for this tobacco that I'm holding in my hand. So I introduced myself, and I typically don't translate my spirit name, but I'm not Blue Thunderbird. I'm not a Thunderbird. My nephew is Thunderbird, but my spirit name is Spirit of the Water, and I was given that name years ago through Pete Kishane when I went out fasting. Have some fasting friends here too. So my family, I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario, and what I'm going to speak about has to do a little bit with our political identities and how that impacts us when we seek out services. But when I introduce myself, I talk about who my family is and where they come from. So my LaValle family and many generations are from the Temiskaming region. The last names include Gauthier, Kaya, Kada, Pepin, Taylor, and Richard, with the Richard line having ties to the Red River. But I also acknowledge the historical region of Temiskaming. I know that's a very highly political statement. My mom was unstated and unknown paternity. She was born in Timmins, Ontario. Her mom was Nancy LaBelle from the Gracefield, Quebec region. And my grandfather, the only grandfather I knew, was Norman Godin from Swan Lake in Manitoba. And the last names there include Godin, McIver, Swain, and Lilly. With respect to this panel, it became very evident when we were having conversations early on that we have all been impacted very closely by housing and homelessness. And, it was a challenge to have that conversation. So in keeping with the introductions, I'll just share that all of my immediate family, which included my mom, my dad, and my two sisters, had been homeless except for my mother. So I was homeless with a master's degree in hand and lived in my car. My sister Suzanne was homeless for many years and lived in her car. My sister Kim became homeless after running away from an abusive relationship when she was 18. And my dad, when he moved into Toronto from Sudbury, he stayed at the shelter at across from Moss Park there at Sherbourne and Queen. So homelessness, housing impacts all of us in different ways. And it's not, all homelessness is not created equal. There's different stories behind that, but just wanted to share that. Miigwech.
I don't know how to turn them on or off either.
I'm just going to not move it around.
Miigwech, thank you. And I'm Suzanne Stewart. I'm from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. Feeling a little nervous because I'm with these amazing people and seeing all of you here, all your hopefully smiling faces. And, it makes me a little bit nervous. So I'm grateful to everyone for coming. Miigwech. I was honored to be invited to speak here, and I'm honored to have my work family here with me. I consider you guys to be my work family. And to thank Wesley for coming, and also to thank the Odette family for making this possible, and to St. Mike's for putting this on, because this is a very important event and a very important topic. So I'm not going to blather on too long because we probably have time as of the essence. So I just want to make sure that I've offered tobacco to the rest of my panelists and to say thank you to them, to acknowledge being here with me. I did pray with that basket before I came here, so miigwech, thank you. I want to acknowledge our traditional helpers who are here, our firekeeper and our Ashkabewis, who are smudging people out in the audience. So if you need to be smudged, can I put this down now and use this one? Okay, well, maybe I'll. If people need to smudge during the presentation or the panel, maybe you can just make a little signal, and one of our helpers will stop and smudge you. Sometimes it's good to. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, this one for the. And does this work or this one? Okay. All right. Well, I'm a mom, so I'm used to having a loud indoor voice. So, but as my kids get older, my voice gets quieter and softer, and I get a lot more mellow, and it's peaceful. So, we did the territorial acknowledgement. So, Massey Cho for that. I don't know where she went. There she is. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge myself as a visitor here. As I said, I'm from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. I grew up, in my community. I also grew up in Alberta, Saskatchewan. I grew up all over the place. But I have a lot to owe to the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people who welcomed me into this community in urban Toronto when I moved here in 2007. I had 2 children and one that was about to be born. And I reached out to a community member who's actually here tonight, who made the Tikanagan for her when she was born, which we still have and, hangs up in her room. So the community has been very welcoming to me. And without the welcome and the warmth and the inclusion that I and my children have had in the time that I've been here, none of the work that I'm going to share with you or any of the stuff that I've done as a researcher and as a clinical psychologist would have been possible. So I just want to acknowledge that relationship I have with the people from here and the communities and the organizations and the traditional people. My children have all gone through all their ceremonies. We have ceremonial land, which is central to all of the work and the research that we do. So that's very important to acknowledge that relationship for me. So you want to know who I am because, they invited me here. They must think that I'm somebody, that has something to share. Well, so this picture was taken when I was in grade 1. I look pretty cute there, don't I? Even when I saw that, I wasn't really sure that it's me because my early childhood memories are a little fuzzy, But I did like the barrette in my hair, I guess. And I had a bowl cut, which I made my son get when he was little. And then my son just turned 25 this last week. So this is when we had our family dinner, my son and my 3 daughters. They're all bigger than me now. So I'm very grateful. So how did I go from being Etsy doctor? That's my birth name. That's who I really am. Etsy in our language means little woman or little grandmother or depending on the dialect, it's got different meanings in different dialects. I grew up with my grandparents near Yellowknife on our traditional land. My mother was 17 when I was born. She was still in residential school when she got pregnant with me. There's a fuzzy story of how she met my dad, so I'm not going to tell that. It's not my story. I thought it was strange when I saw residential school records that she was in residential school 6 months past my birth date. So I'm not really sure how that worked out, but that's what the federal government seems to think. And after I was born Etsy doctor, I lived with my grandparents till I was about 4. They didn't speak any English, only Quicho in our language. That was their way of resisting colonization because they'd had all 13 of their children taken by age 4 or 5. To residential school, and then they were taking care of me, one of their grandchildren, and they didn't want that to happen to me, so they sent me to live with a relative in Edmonton, Alberta, when I was 4. And that's when my name was changed to Suzanne, legally changed. I was adopted by a non-Indigenous relative by blood, and she changed my name to Suzanne, so then I became Suzanne. And I stayed with her for a while, but then she didn't want me anymore, so she put me in foster care. And so I was in and out of foster homes that I kept running away from, of course. And then I was, because I was running away from foster homes, I was out on living on the street for a number of years. I was doing all kinds of crazy things when I was like 13, 14. And because I was living on the street, I was picked up by a rich white man who was traveling through town, and I was, I guess now they use these words like sex trafficked, right? I was sex trafficked for 6 years till I was 20. And then I escaped when I was 20. He took me deep into the US. I escaped when I was 20, and I came back here with the clothes on my back, and here I am. I just kind of picked up from there, and I'm just saying, because my kids, teenagers now, they're so entitled. They're like, I want this, I want that. I'm like, I came back here with the clothes on my back when I was 20, and everything that we have is because I've worked hard for 30 years so that you guys wouldn't have to live the way that I lived, and you guys wouldn't have to have the experience that I had. And as they get older, hopefully they'll begin to understand that. But if anyone's raised teenage girls, they could maybe give me some tips about that. My son's good now. He's grown up. Yeah. So, that's sort of where I was. And when I came back to Canada when I was 20, I just started partying and picked up where I left off when I was sex trafficked out of Canada. And that was fun to party. And then when I was 25, I woke up one day and I'm like, I'm bored of partying. I want to become a psychologist because I'm always helping people. Even then, everyone stayed in my home. I always had money. On my own, I'm very self-sufficient. I could make money. I could take care of myself. I could make things happen. And so I always had people needing my help when I was a kid even, like in my family. So at 25, I'm like, I should be getting paid for this. I'm just helping people for free all the time. So I went to school for 10 years and became a psychologist when I was 35, and that's when I got offered this job at U of T, and that's how I got to be Suzanne Stewart. But I did get married to Andrew Stewart, and I had his kids, and here we are, but we're divorced now. That's another story. You don't want to hear that. So that's why we're here. That's why I'm here. That's who I am, and that's how I got here, and that's why they asked me to be here, because I went back to school. I was very passionate about wanting to end Indigenous homelessness. I think that may have been too lofty of a goal when I graduated from school, thinking that I was going to do that. But I think I definitely want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem anymore. And that's another thing I say to my kids, you want to be part of the solution. You don't want to be part of the problem. And that's why you have to stop smoking drugs. You have to stop drinking. You have to stay in school. You got to do these things. And that dedication brought me to this place I am now, where I've been fortunate enough to work with organizations to look at Indigenous homelessness. Why are we looking at Indigenous homelessness tonight, and why have I been working on it for 25 years? I know I only look 27, but I'm actually 37. So why? Because it's a problem. It has significance. That's what they would say in the data. There's an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the homeless population. Very difficult to measure because there's a lack of data about this. Those counts they do at night, those aren't really accurate, because where I'm from in the north, every home is overfilled with people couch surfing. Throughout the years, I have 10 people at any given time living in my home here in Toronto, because people need to sleep on the couch. They need to sleep in the spare room. I've had people sleeping in the landing of between floors at different times, because they remember Uncle Michael living there, sleeping there. We just put a mattress there because there was a space, right? Those aren't counted in the homelessness count. So, we know that Indigenous people have a higher rate of homelessness than non-Indigenous people. And, over the last, I would say maybe 10 years, that really was something that began to be explored. But until the last 10 to 15 years, that's not something that was of interest in the academic world. There was no interest, and that was something that I wanted to look into. As an Indigenous person, I knew the answer to that, but we needed to go out and find the evidence and do the research, even though we all knew what was going on. So the prevalence is one reason we would talk about Indigenous homelessness tonight. A second reason is, well, equity. If we know it's a bigger problem for Indigenous people, Canada comes to, every problem with an equity lens. Canada prides itself as being multicultural. The Prime Minister's running around saying Canada's strength is its diversity. Well, how does that work for Indigenous people? Well, it doesn't, because there are federal and provincial laws that protect the culture and the identity of multi-diverse groups, but not Indigenous people. We have laws and policies that make being Indigenous illegal and punishable by law. And that's in the Indian Act. And that's a whole nother presentation, but that's where these problems started with homelessness, in the laws and policies of the Indian Act. So the third reason why we want to talk about Indigenous homelessness tonight is because right now we are living in this context of Indigenous reconciliation. We started out tonight by talking about the importance of that. Everyone who's spoken almost has brought up this term reconciliation. And, what does that mean? Well, it means that the government has taken a stance that it's got a project of building new relationships based on recognition, respects, and the rights of Indigenous people, by acknowledging that harms have been committed against Indigenous people and taking steps and actions to reduce or eliminate those harms and take responsibility for that. And that's where that Truth and Reconciliation final report and calls to action come in, because that's what we're supposed to be doing in Canada. That's what the country is doing as a government. It's enacting reconciliation. That should be on the lips of all Canadians. Should now know what that means. But the sad fact is that most people actually don't know what it means in concrete terms. And what it means is that everyone in Canada has to take responsibility for decolonizing. That means undoing what's been done by all those colonial policies and laws of the Indian Act that are still being done today. And because the Indian Act is the law that created the country, because Canada wouldn't exist without the Indian Act, because when the new country was formed, there was already millions of people living here. They had to get rid of those people. How to do that? Legally, by creating a law that said, we're going to get rid of these people, and here's all the ways we're going to do it, through assimilation or death. So we're going to put them in places of severe deprivation, or where they're going to have to live, reserves, and we're going to take them out of there bit by bit and force them to assimilate. That's what the Indian Act was about, and that's what it did, and that was what had to happen in their view to create a country. Get rid of the people who are already there so they could have unfettered access to the lands and natural resources necessary to build a new country for immigrants to come from Western Europe. So that left us in a place in a country where we have a country full of people who are two groups based on the creation of the country. A group of people who were harmed by the creation and the running of the country today, and a group of people who benefit from the creation and the running of Canada today. And, the Indigenous people are the ones who were harmed by the creation and the ongoing systemic things that happen to run the country on the daily basis. And then everyone else are all the people who benefit. So in fact, residential schools had a bigger impact on non-Indigenous people because it allowed all non-Indigenous people to have the privilege of living in their country, to go to school, to have a home, to have a job, to have money, to have a bank, to have all the things that non-Indigenous people have are built directly on the harms perpetrated and that still get perpetrated on Indigenous people. So reconciliation means taking responsibility for us. We're deeply wounded physically, mentally, emotionally by what's happened. We have to take responsibility for our own healing. And we're doing that, right? Because I'd be dead if I wasn't doing that. Literally, I would be dead. And so would every other Indigenous person if they weren't working on their own healing in some way. That's our responsibility. We can't blame and say, you know what, the white man did this, the government did this. Maybe they did, but now that I'm hurt, I got to heal myself with whatever resources I can get from you and from you and from you, from my children, from my friends, from my community, from the doctors in this hospital. And it's everyone else's responsibility who's not Indigenous to stop perpetrating the harms of colonialism in the way that they are laid out in the calls to action. The calls to action tell everybody how to stop harming Indigenous people. Don't know what to do? Get that book, look at it. A friend of mine who is a non-Indigenous person, she's from Germany, she came here a few years ago, she started a business, and she's very serious, earnestly, what can I do for reconciliation, Suzanne? And I said, well, you run a business, right? She's like, yeah. I'm like, let all Indigenous people take courses for free in your school, your ballet school. Hire an Indigenous person to work in the office. You know, those are just ways that any person can do anything. You know, don't be racist in your actions. Anyway, I could go on about that. I have a whole talk about reconciliation. But that's the kind of the context. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking about Indigenous homelessness. Let's talk about the issues and the solutions. So I've been doing research, fortunately, with Indigenous communities, and I'm very grateful for the last 16 years. I'm going to share the highlights of 8 of these projects. I've done many more than 8 projects in the 16 years, but I'm going to share some of the highlights of 8 projects that focus specifically on homelessness. And you know, I was so afraid to continue to perpetrate the harms of research when I moved here in 2007 that I lived and worked and participated in the Indigenous community for 2 years before I felt like I had the nerve that I could go to anybody who ran an organization and say, hey, can we do some research together? So I went to the Native Center every week. I sent my kids to Head Start. You know, I let people in the community get to know me before, and it was 2009 when I started asking people, would you be interested in doing some research with me? Do you have something you want to research and we could work on? You know, kind of, that's how it started. So let's start with where I first started doing research here in Toronto, and that was in partnership with the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. And I went to the ED and I said, you know, what are some of the things that are going on with youth? Because I'd had experience doing youth research for my supervisor at UVic, where I did my graduate degrees. And he said, well, you know, mental health and work. I'm like, well, what about homelessness? And he says, work, employment, that's what's keeping our young people from getting housing. They don't have jobs. You know, they have problems getting and keeping jobs. You should do some research on youth employment and education, life transitions. So over the years, we had multiple projects looking at youth mental health and life transitions and how that helps young people to resist homelessness. And sort of the results from these studies were really about understanding that for young people in downtown Toronto to resist homelessness, we had to pay attention to things like how involved are they in community? What were some of the things that happened in the early parts of their lives? What were those relationships like? Who were their primary caregivers? What was the quality of their relationships in the first part of their lives? What were their educational experiences? Were they positive or negative? But the biggest thing that young people talked about as important to their mental health and the ability to resist homelessness. So over this time, I think we did something like, 150 interviews with Indigenous youth who accessed the services at the Native Canadian Centre in these 3 projects. And what they really talked about as critical was their identity. And they had an understanding of their identity in mainstream culture, like, in Toronto, like living in downtown Toronto. But then they also had their identity in Indigenous culture that could only be accessed through certain resources that organizations provided. And that was like kind of the biggest ticket item for the young people. It wasn't, trauma, it wasn't, school, it wasn't, these other things were important, but their identity and having access to traditional knowledges, to elders, to cultural things, to, spirit names, all these things that people needed were a big deal to young people. So, from that research that we did all those years with the young people, some really core recommendations came out. And these are things that are really important. And it's about not ghettoizing Indigenous professionals in Indigenous health, Indigenous mental health, social services. And this research that was done 15 years ago, I feel like this is what laid the groundwork to create the type of positions that exist now. Now we have a lead for Indigenous health at St. Michael's Hospital. 15 years ago, 17 years ago, there was no way that would have been considered or even allowed. In fact, 15 years ago, I wouldn't even be up here sharing this stuff because it wouldn't be considered important. And so, that was one thing that the young people and the people who worked with them thought was really important, is that every time anything Indigenous had to happen, it was off to the side or it wasn't important. Another big thing that young people said was really important was do not place non-Indigenous people in leadership positions in anything Indigenous. And this is really, they were saying this before the TRC came out. The TRC is saying stuff like this, but our young people have been saying this for decades. And really, because it's about, part of healing is about reclaiming our autonomy and self-determination. That's very important. Racism and negative stereotypes continued to be major issues for our young people. And this really had an influence on how they developed their identity. And being connected to community, culture, and family, whatever family looks like, because we all have our chosen families in the city as well, is really important in resisting homelessness for the young people. So the other big piece of research, and I'm glad that Steve is here because he could answer more questions about this, is when I approached NAMI-RES in 2013 about doing some research around this, I was really welcomed in a good way, and all of the students, because it was my job to find Indigenous students to come and do graduate degrees. So all of the Indigenous students, we had a Métis student who did the Métis traditional knowledges research. We had a Mi'kmaq student who did the traditional knowledges and elders. We had a non-Indigenous student who did the trauma, service, and support, who was a person who cared a lot about our community. And honestly, I don't remember who did the harm reduction stuff. Probably that was me and Jessica Surratt, I think. So we had a big data set, and this was very important work because it allowed everyone to be out in actually helping people, as part of the research. And I'm not going to read this to you because actually we had a lot of what the government and the funders call KT material from this. We created a graphic novel, which I still have hundreds of them, so I put a bunch up there if you want to take it from the results of this, because one of the things that the community said is they wanted to have things that weren't just reports. They wanted to have written material that made sense to people. So we created a graphic novel. We had so many workshops. And basically after all this data collection, this research, it was really about understanding that there's a relationship between everything that happens in a person's life that gets them to that place of being at risk, of not having a house. And then these factors all mediate this ongoing cycle of homelessness. And that once you become homeless, if you're Indigenous, it's very hard to get stably housed again, because the holistic supports are just not there, except in maybe like one place, like NAMI-RES and Sagatay. If you try to go somewhere else to get those wraparound services, forget it, because you might see a doctor here and then they want you to go across town to see a social worker, and then they want you to go over here to see a psychiatrist. They want you to go over here to see an employment counselor. That doesn't happen to people who are precariously housed, that they can access the supports if they're not all in one place. And that was really one of the strengths that came out, was showing why all of the services and programs at NAMI Res were so successful were because they provided everything as much as they could right there. Even a COVID clinic to meet the need as things went forward. This was long before COVID, of course, but that's what makes things successful, is having everything there. And of course, there's that underlying tension of affordable housing as an issue, but that's not the driving force. There's more to it than housing. It's about decolonization. It's about addressing the holistic needs. It's about, understanding that people are sometimes unhoused because that's where they feel safe. That's where they feel that sense of belonging. That's where they feel that they have family. And if you get into housing, you've lost all that. So it's about understanding that people need workers and programs who are going to work with them at that level and at that pace and at that place. So I'll leave you to read the details of it, but that's the upshot, and we have all the brochures. There's a table up there with a lot of stuff. So another project that I've worked in has been Making the Shift. Now, that is a very large project. It's a national center of excellence that is about working to end youth homelessness across Canada. Lofty goal. So, of course, as the Indigenous person, I was put in charge of the Indigenous aspect of this big $17 million grant from SHRC. And how much of it came down to the Indigenous part? Very little, let's say. But, we did do some good work with this. And really, Making the Shift was about getting this large amount of money, setting up a center, setting up the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, which was already operating, but that further enforce that, and funding Indigenous researchers from the community to do their work on homelessness. That was really what this is about. So Jesse Thistle, he's someone who did his work through Making the Shift and the COH, did a lot of good work in mentoring and supporting Indigenous researchers to work in Indigenous homelessness. So one thing that the Making the Shift did was start these youth homelessness social innovation lab. So I was involved in one of the actual projects, apart from being involved in Making the Shift at the senior administrative level. And that was a project that was called Undayan at the Hamilton Regional Indian Center. And it was about taking that housing first for youth and doing an Indigenous adaptation of that. So we published a few things out of that, and the evaluation is ongoing for that program. So you can look that up on the internet, although I'm sure you have other things to do than read these types of articles. But Making the Shift is an ongoing, it's a big 10-year thing. So Making the Shift is a great place if anyone's interested in doing youth homelessness research to go on their website and to apply for funds, because it's very community driven. So and it's not just Indigenous, it's for all researchers in homelessness, but there is a focus on Indigenous youth homelessness. More recently, I've also been doing work at the national policy level with the Congress of Aboriginal People. And the Congress of Aboriginal People is the national political group aimed at meeting the social and health needs of off-reserve First Nations, status and non-status Indians, Métis and Inuit people living in urban areas. So the Congress of Aboriginal People actually approached me and asked me to help them with their homelessness file, which I was very honored to do that. And they wanted to do some work around developing a national Indigenous off-reserve housing strategy. So this is kind of a big plan that we have that's ongoing. Last year, we just started working with them. We did a scoping review, which was presented in one of our monthly webinars at the Ontario Near. You can go on the Ontario Near website and see all of our webinars are archived on there that you can watch anytime you want, and there's a brochure up there about how to access those. The second step is to do a national consultation with all of the provincial territorial organizations that are connected to the National Congress of Aboriginal People, and to go out there and ask them, what do you need for an Indigenous off-reserve housing strategy, that sort of thing. And then to actually develop, implement, and evaluate the strategy, which is going to happen over the next 2 years. If anyone wants to come and work on that, please just let me know, because we could use all the help we can get with any kind of research assistance or partners. So, it was very interesting when we did the scoping review on this creating a national Indigenous off-reserve housing strategy, because things came to light which 10 years ago weren't out there in the literature, and that is, really understanding that being homeless impacts the spiritual well-being of people. 10 years ago, that wasn't something that was out there, and we knew about it, but it wasn't something that we could talk about in the quote-unquote literature. And, discrimination and racism continue to be big ticket items in terms of lack of housing, as well as understanding that Indigenous women and two-spirited people were disproportionately affected by homelessness within the Indigenous homeless population. And that homelessness is actually not a personal issue, it's actually a purely systemic issue, and is the result of the ongoing legacy of colonization. And that's an important piece when we're trying to find solutions to homelessness, that we can start to move away from what's wrong with this person, why can't they stay housed, to what's wrong with the system, why is it continuing to keep people on the street. So, and of course, enumeration. We know that's an issue. Data, and especially any kind of big data, data that wants to find significance, is an issue for Indigenous people because of the colonial context and the history of harm of everything, not just research, but everything, healthcare, education. I don't even fill out the census, and I'm a researcher. I don't. They're like, we're going to arrest you. I'm like, arrest me. Go ahead, just try, because it's not going to happen. So, the solutions at this national policy level for off-reserve Indigenous housing is really about finding the strengths and resiliency, like moving away from this problem-focused lens for homelessness, understanding that empathy is what's at the core of finding a sustainable housing solution, decolonizing policy and practice, and really translation of strengths and needs into programs that are developed by Indigenous peoples and community leaders. And the people who are community leaders and workers in here know how hard that is, and how much that the system has tried to shut us down and quiet our voices. And now everybody, Indigenous, is invited to the table, but frankly, are we being listened to? Probably not. So that's what has to happen. And, understanding that housing is a human right, and a lack of it is a human rights violation. Policy and practice have to be grounded in spirituality. And empathy has to be understood systemically. Try to wrap your heads around that. I can't even when I think about it. And self-determination is really one of the key things. So during the pandemic, I was approached by one of our community partners, Anishinaabe Health, who had struck up a partnership with St. Michael's Hospital to do some research around the impact of COVID on Indigenous homeless people. And so I joined the team at the request of the community partner, and we changed the name to Kugagi. How? Pimetsuwin. Well, we just call it the Kugagi for short because I'm very scared of pronouncing things wrong in Anishinaabe-Moan. So we got a traditional name. We went to see a healer. We got a traditional name for a spiritual name to help us to sort of decolonize and indigenize this project with our colleagues, Dr. Stephen Huang and his team over at MAP at Unity Health here at St. Michael's Hospital. So that was just wonderful. And part of the research was having the whole team down at our spiritual space to do ceremony. And that's where this picture was taken with the research team down after I don't know if this was probably before we went into the lodge, because everyone looks pretty perky there and happy, not exhausted and sweaty afterwards. So this was really great research, and what this research was really about was understanding how the global pandemic affected people who were living rough on the streets. And, a lot of it was around the problems that occurred in shelters, that there was violence and racism that were exacerbated during the pandemic, and that Indigenous cultural connection remained the most important thing for being stable while not being housed during the pandemic. And that Indigenous identity was very important because people needed to have cultural connections in order to deal with the barriers of racism that came up in every single service that they tried to access. One person said, I don't tell anybody that I'm Aboriginal just for the fact that I don't want to have that problem. I try to do that, but it doesn't seem to work. So another project that we've been doing that came up during the pandemic was really looking at how Indigenous women were being, street-involved Indigenous women in downtown Toronto were being serviced during the pandemic at Native Women's Resource Center. So I have a strong relationship with them as well. And, a lot of the community members who access service there who are street involved, really felt like they needed extra support on the ground, like food and housing services had to be amped up during the pandemic, and that cultural and spiritual services also had to continue, because during the pandemic, everything became a crisis for Indigenous women, in downtown Toronto, because the shelters closed. Remember, that was part of what the issue was, is that shelters closed. And where were people going to go? Where were women who were resisting violence going to go? Where were children and women going to be? Where were people who were in other shelters going to go when all of a sudden they were all closed? So, part of this research was really saying that, about this voice at the table of policy change. And that's something that's what the issue is right now, is that policy change has to happen, and it has to be driven by our Indigenous community leaders and members. And that funding needs to continue to increase the self-efficacy and strengthen the relationship that organizations like Native Women have with the government and with other Indigenous organizations to meet these kind of evolving needs. Because right now, we're still seeing the big fallout of the pandemic in terms of mental health and physical health problems among the homeless population. Well, among everyone. But remember, homeless people are more vulnerable, right? We're all vulnerable, right? But they're more vulnerable. So I just gave you like a quick snapshot of the homeless research I've been doing for the 16 years, and you want to know, what does all this mean? And remember, there's brochures about each project with all the methodology and the results up there on the table if you want to take it away. What does all this mean? Well, in terms of Indigenous homelessness, traditional knowledge is central to healing. That was true in all of the research that we've done. That was very important. Decolonization goes hand in hand with healing. Healing can't happen without decolonizing everything. Our minds, our bodies, the people we work with, the places we work with, even coming in here and smudging. That's both decolonizing and indigenizing, but I hate those words. But 10 years ago, we would have been told, you can't light that in here. And I was told that everywhere I worked at the U of T. I was like, stop me. We're lighting this in here. You invited me here as an Indigenous person to do Indigenous research, and I can't practice as an Indigenous person. That doesn't make sense to me. So all of a sudden, oh, you're allowed to smudge at OISE now. Oh, you're allowed to smudge at public health. Now everyone's smudging in the hospitals, because other people like me came forward and were like, we're doing this. And then harm reduction. That's another important piece to addressing the needs. The cultural identity imbalance. This is something that's very important. People, because of the racism that we all experience on a daily basis, and anyone who's not white, doesn't matter what you are, if you're not white, they treat you differently out there. In every system. Not just in the stores, but in the, in the drugstore, in the healthcare setting, in, school, in the police walk into police station, into court, anything. You're not white, you're going to get treated differently. Everybody knows that. So, and that's all been internalized, and we all have to, find a way as a system to deal with this, because that's created a lot of conflict for people. I grew up, I used to be told by my aunt to get in the shower every day bath. Every Sunday I'd have to take a bath. Sunday was bath. I had to scrub my elbows and my knees because they were black because I was dirty. They weren't black, they were just darker because I'm brown and the skin, goes there, right? We're not dirty because we're not white. But a lot of us, I'm over that obviously, but sometimes I do feel like that ugly squaw I was called, like that, all those names I got called growing up, that doesn't really go away. And then every time something little happens around here, you look at me wrong, or I think you're like judging me, I go back to that place. Oh, I got to scrub my elbows, So we have to deal with that in the system. We have to fix that. And that early life trauma and intergenerational trauma, that's another mediator of homelessness. There's the failure of the social safety net. That's a systemic issue. We have to educate health and social service systems. We need to continue to focus on partnerships and connections. And, the research said we have to focus on resilience, because that's what everyone is. And I hate that word because it's so like patriarchal and colonial. Oh, you went through so much, dear, you're so resilient. Okay, well, I had no choice because I had a baby and I had to stay alive for him. I had to keep going. That's why I'm here, for him, for his sisters. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be here. I have no reason to live. All factors of Indigenous homelessness are interconnected, and that's a systemic issue. So the key takeaways, I know you're sick of hearing me and we got to get over here. So oppression is the key barrier. Healing is an issue across the board. We got to remediate this culture clash, between Indigenous healing, traditional knowledges, and harm reduction, because we have to meet people. I don't have an answer to that. I don't have an answer to any of these. I'm just saying these are the things that are coming up. We have to deal with these. These haven't been dealt with. And, Indigenous research methodologies can contribute to healing when we're working with our communities driving the research. So, and the biggest thing to take away is that connection to culture is healing and needs to be formally introduced at all levels of service. I'm a psychologist, so of course I'm going to say, see a psychologist. Go to therapy. It's covered under NIHB. This is what kids need. Some of those are my kids when they were little. And if they hadn't done that, I don't know where they'd be now. My daughter, that one who's there with the standing, she now works at Native Women's full-time. She has the hardest job there, but she's there. And I feel like culture helped put her in that place, So we came up with a little model based on all this work. Steve and I came up with this. This is really from the NAMI-RES research, and we're still working on it in a book. The book's going to come out. I'm working on my sabbatical now. So we created this kind of multi-relational model that shows how homelessness and mental health is dynamic. And it has all these things. It's about individual challenges and supports. It's about the barriers. It's about social policy that is what is like holding, is the context of homelessness. Trauma, harm reduction, elders, Indigenous knowledges, those are all things that the person needs to address. And then this is kind of what that same model looks like as a cutaway. If you see this moving like a cylinder and how it could look, what needs to be changed? What supports do we have to do? How can we change policy? What can we do? How can we address trauma, address harm reduction, bring elders in, have Indigenous knowledges? Those are central to the puzzle, to how this works. And P.S., my last thing, get rid of the social determinants of health, because this is saying what's wrong with us. This is not determining me. If this was determining me, I wouldn't be alive, right? We need this, indigenous determinants of health. And, you know, this is very important that we focus on these things. You know, that bunny's cute. But he's also dinner, so don't get too attached to him. You know, love and relationships, that's what I heard my panelists talking about. And all this in a larger framework of autonomy and self-determination. You know, this is where we need to go. So, you know, we're taking responsibility for our healing. Everyone, every Native person who's alive is healing. And, you know, what are the rest of you doing, the non-Indigenous people? How are you stopping perpetrating these harms? And, you know, that's up to you guys to figure out. So you can text me, email me, call me, and that's it. So thank you.
Okay, I'm not really sure how to follow that. Thank you for that incredibly informative presentation and for beautifully and brutally laying bare how we've got to the place that we are today. I'm so excited that we have the panelists that we have today. So now we're going to do about 35 minutes of just what will probably be a very organic discussion around solutions. Again, everyone's given me the good grace of letting me use their first names. So Suzanne, thank you for laying the groundwork and pointing out how we got here. And my idea was to start with Wesley, just to put him a little bit on the spot. You and I had I have an opportunity to chat with the panelists beforehand, which really helps me as well. And you are part of NAMERES's men's housing program, or that's how you were able to get housing. And we talked a little bit about, there's programs with basic life skills and everything else, but I was hoping you could speak to the cultural components or what the community environment meant to you in terms of your path towards housing.
Okay.
You're gonna do great.
All right. So my homelessness started quite a while ago. So my biological mother was a 60s scoop, and because of that, she had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls, and my sister is there right now, being so supportive as usual. So we were adopted out, and there's reasons that I believe we were adopted for. And this is what it is, right? Our father as a child, had polio and couldn't use his right leg, so he walked on crutches. And he needed a girl too, and he needed a boy to mow the lawn, shovel the driveway, pile the wood. And we were housed, we were fed, we were clothed, but it was a bit of a tumultuous upbringing because the parents that first adopted us, I think, as his story goes, that she couldn't deal with us. She had some substance abuse issues, so she didn't want us, but the father did want us, so they divorced, and he kept us. And then, so he remarried, and they had children of their own. And again, I was mowing the lawn, shoveling the driveway, doing all the labor around the house. My sister was doing a lot of housework and taking care of the kids that they'd had. And so I wasn't, when I was in school, I told my friends this too. It's always been like, if you've ever seen Charlie Brown, the teacher's going, rah, 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 rah. That's what I was hearing. Because I was staring out the window watching birds fly by and trying to figure out how does that work. So I wasn't very good in school. I wasn't, not that I was not smart, I just couldn't focus. Maybe some attention deficit disorder of some sort. Because I wasn't doing well in school, I was always grounded. So what I would do, and it was, I would sneak out of the house at night, get on my bicycle, and cruise around this little town that we grew up in. And it would be after midnight, and in little towns, there's no nightlife really, so I got the whole town to myself. And I'm riding my bicycle all through the town, and that was such a sense of freedom that I got, just because I'd go out. And then the teacher would call home and say, why is Wesley sleeping in class all day long? So there was that. And so he was looking for me in my room one night, and I wasn't there, so he jumped in his car and came and found me. And so before that, if I didn't do my homework or I didn't whatever, we get a spanking on the bottom. But that wasn't doing very much to me. So things got a little more physical. And at that point, I was like, no, this isn't right. So I started running away. And because I had to survive, I started a little life of crime, which meant I was stealing food from stores, doing what I had to do to survive. So by later on, so my homelessness started when I was 13 years old. And something through that, I'd get in trouble. And there is a juvenile detention center outside of Sudbury, Ontario called Cecil Facer Youth Center. And I was in and out of there till between when I was 13 till I was up to 17, in and out, in and out, in and out. And I had some really great friends and some really great family members. So there was and one of my family members so I had this stuff going on. And I still need these words to this day. And because there were good things growing up, because both these parents were teachers, they worked hard. So there was some good things, and there were some bad things. So I did. I took the good and left the bad. When I was 17, I realized that once I turn 18, I'm going to be an adult, and I'm going to go to a real jail. So I went and got a job. But so the impact of being homeless at a young age and enduring physical abuse, Um, that I did. So I turned to alcohol, and if anything, I did it in a way. I don't know if anybody might understand this or not, but it kind of helped me escape and help me cope. Um, but obviously, that you can't live like that. So when I was 18, I was always drawn to Toronto. Um, so I got on a bus, on a Greyhound bus when it existed, and I came to Toronto, and my aunt and uncle, they lived at Jane and Finch. So that was a bit of a culture shock. But, and actually, I didn't even plan on staying in Toronto. I was on my way to Welland. And I called my aunt and uncle from the bus depot downtown. And I said, I'm in Toronto. I'm here for a few hours. So I just thought I'd call and say hi. So my uncle said, well, why don't you come over and spend the night and get back on the bus tomorrow? So I did. And I was in Toronto for years after that. And then, due to alcoholism again, lost my housing, ended up at the Native Men's Residence. The very first time I was there was in 1990, when I was 20 years old. And it's a lot different now. Back then, I think they had 26 beds. Now I don't know how many they have now, but it's a lot. So that was my first experience with Native Men's Residence. And again, dealing with alcoholism, being in and out, off the streets, housed on the streets, back to res. So that was, and being homeless is, it's, to me, it just became, since I was a kid, I've slept on the sidewalk and I've eaten pizza crust off the ground, and it's been really not easy. But so I did, and so I did my Young Offenders Act, getting in and out of trouble. And then, like I said, when I was 18, I decided I was going to get a job and stop getting into trouble. And to this day, I'm 53 now, and I've managed to stay out of trouble, and I still don't have a criminal record. I'm employed by Canada Post. I've been off work for some time because in the workplace, so there's a big plant on Eastern Avenue, and I worked on the main floor, I worked on the second floor, and not only homelessness, but on any given shift, day shift, afternoon, night shift, whatever, if there's 100 people on the floor where I'm working, I'm the only visibly Native person there. And I've been, and I'll do this for you. I've heard, woo, 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 woo. I turn around and I can't see, everybody's doing their work and nobody's looking at me, pretending they didn't see anybody do it, or whoever did it didn't, wasn't making eye contact. Everybody was just going about. So that um, is stressful. So yeah, I took time off work. I've been off for a while now, and so, but I've got that, and when it comes to Indigenous housing and lack of it, so the Native men's residence does great in that regard. There could be more work done. And again, I guess funding is a big part of it. And I've still got some things to work on. But hopefully, I do hope to one day get educated and maybe work in the field of homelessness and Indigenous sovereignty, or how do you say that word? But yeah, so, and again, so I am where I am, and I can't say, I don't know how to say it. It's not all my fault. I've had a lot of help along the way through friends, childhood friends, family members, community members. Culturally, I go to powwows when there are some. I go to sweat lodges. But due to COVID, that's shut a lot of stuff down. And but I want to get back into them and do some positive things in the community, and not just the Native community, but there's a lot of work to be done. But I think the Indigenous, like I remember the Native men's residents did back in the day have a van which we would load up with food and cruise around the streets and stop by and feed homeless people. But again, I think that the funding maybe it just isn't there anymore. So, but that's something that could be worked on, I guess. Ceci?
Yeah, that's great. And I mean,
Yeah.
I think, hopefully you actually will get into the work, or I
Right.
think you'd be a huge asset to anyone doing research on this topic. So please do that, or hopefully you get support to do that. Rennie, I wanted to maybe take it over to you because we were talking a little bit before about sort of, this ties into what you'd said about community, Wesley, about the importance of, housing alone isn't the solution. Or can we talk a little bit about how health and housing are tied together and what a model might look like that would be good in terms of supportive services?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Wesley, for sharing your story. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
It's so true that housing is really foundational when we're talking about wellness. And I think about that. I think about how it is that we come into this world. And, we come into this world because the Creator felt this tremendous amount of love. And with that love, this spark, plummeted through the universe and came to hover over the earth. And then the Creator, looked upon us and knew that we needed to keep this light going. And so sent us a heart and a heartbeat, which would continue that cycle of life. And then the next thing the Creator did was give us a mind so we could think, we could analyze, we could plan, and we could be in a world together that's connected. And then the Creator, lastly, gave us a vessel. and that's our body. And everything that we are a part of from the inside is connected to our body. And this body, this vessel, connects to everything on the outside world, right through the universe. And I think about this, that our bodies, our vessels, are our first home. And then as we go through life, housing and having a home becomes very important for people. It's very rooting. You know, you feel very grounded when you have a home. You feel supported. You feel surrounded. You know, sometimes there's roommates or friends or family, pets, plants, you know, whatever it is, photographs, whatever it is that someone has that's their own space. And whether they live, you know, on their own or with others, like that's just a really important way of being in the world. And, you know, we have these expressions like, we have to get our house in order. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean, you know, for someone who's homeless or who's been living precariously because that's just, you know, all that they've had access to in terms of supports. And so I think it's really important that we really come together. And many of us have, like, I feel like at a crux between all the lived experience with my family members and then, you know, being so involved in the healthcare system and the supports that we need to coordinate and develop for our people. And, you know, when I think of, you know, my family, you know, and I was adopted, and I have this belief that in our culture, we choose our parents based on what it is that we need to learn to evolve our spirit. And I also believe that I chose my adopted parents because my adopted mother was a psychiatric nurse and worked at the very hospitals that I now work in. And my adopted father had a number of mental illnesses, and in the 70s was hospitalized at Whitby Psychiatric, which is called Ontario Shores now, and received high amounts of electric shock on levels that they would never use today. So he had significant brain damage, and he was an engineer before who designed ski areas throughout Ontario and Quebec. After that, he became homeless, and in fact, we lost him for about 15 years. So as a teenager, being like 15, 16, I was walking around the streets looking for him, looking in Allen's Gardens, going to Seton House, and other shelters where I thought that I might find him. And then, so, you know, didn't really, as cycles repeat themselves in our lives, as we know, a few years later, I fell very deeply in love with my first true love. And he was very much like me. We were both mixed. Both our mothers were Ojibways, and our fathers were British, mostly Scottish and English. And we had a child together. Our son's now 33. And you know, after we separated, it was really challenging because he kind of kept it together for a few years and then just couldn't. He came from a long history of homelessness himself, and I've talked with him too. We actually even talked again today about this because he knew I was doing this panel and gave me permission to talk about his story. And in all the years that we've been supporting him, and I've had to remind my son, you know, like we have to think about what it is that we're learning by walking this pathway with him, because we're learning a lot. And as hard and difficult and frustrating that it's been during these times, I found that it's so important not to be judgmental and not to make assumptions either. This is why I support harm reduction services for our people. We have to meet people with where they're at. And, you know, around the assumption piece, you know, people could look at his family and have a number of various different opinions that I would know are not true, because I know how much love was in that family, and I know when homelessness started. I know that it started in poverty when his grandparents were living in Rama and their children froze during the night. They were all sleeping in one bed together, and the only one that survived was his mother because she was in the middle of all the children. And so this family grew up with this pain, and his mother became homeless. He ended up becoming homeless, and the grandfather had been homeless. And so my son's dad grew up going down to Queen Street to visit his grandfather in a cardboard box. And they would do this all the time. And Grandpa never gave up his role as being a grandpa. And he'd often have $5 for them, stuck away in his little pockets. One time they went down there and he had 2 little red bikes. And I think about that, you know, I think, oh man, like he was such a great showman. He actually quit drinking in his 60s and ended up living in Wigwamen, which is beside the Native Canadian Centre. His name was Patty Miigwetz, and he died in 2006. But his last 20 years of his life, he really talked about what it was like to be homeless in Toronto, and then what it was like to stop using alcohol and to get housed. And he missed 2 generations of his family growing up, and then he was able to be with his great-grandchildren when they were growing until they were teenagers. And so I think about that life and what it is that that we experience in being part of our families. And it's been really hard for my son's father because he struggled with alcoholism so much, and he's been to so many of the treatment centers that we have in Ontario and in many detoxes. But it wasn't until he was diagnosed with cancer in 2018 that we were able to successfully finally connect him with the Anishinaabe Health RAM clinic. And because he had cancer, not because of his alcoholism, would he get connected to healthcare. And so with that, we were able to get him. Then we went into COVID. He survived his cancer treatment. He was first placed in a hotel, and then he was able to get an Anishinaabe Health subsidy to be able to live in one of the houses on Bathurst. And that was so important to kind of getting him off the street, considering he was coming through these surgeries. But he was still living precariously. It was like he was homeless in his room. And when we discovered how very neglected he was about a year ago, I was really worried. And I felt very sad too. I thought, here's one of our family members that doesn't have the ability to reach out to services, doesn't feel that he's worth anything, doesn't feel that he's worth any investments, felt he's too dirty to go to the hospital to get the care that he needed for his hand that had been very swollen from an infection. And so in my neighborhood where I live in East York, there was a new development that Wood Green Services was able to create at 540 Cedarville. And this was, there was a lot of community resistance, I have to say too, and those are things that really bother me when communities have these meetings where they don't want, you know, a building such as this in the neighborhood. So what they have is a 59-unit building that was prefab. It's 3 floors, and they each have their own individual bachelor apartments with their own bathrooms, their own kitchenettes. So he was able to move in I guess the beginning of April, I want to say, or May. And that was like a really hard piece too. There needed to be many things coming together, including NAMERES's support as well. Because we have a connected system, it's really important to be able to have the system work when it's able to. And since he's moved into this unit, it's been really interesting because he's gone beyond this, you know, place of being in survival mode and thinking about what's going to happen each day, to now being able to address his primary care issues. When he walked in, he kind of looked around. He's like, "Oh, hey, buddy," and there was some guys that he knew from other shelters or just being in the community. And he's caring about other people. He told me there's this lady, he's like, "This old Nish lady, I'm worried about her bones. The beds are so uncomfortable. Can we get her a little mat for her bed?" So I was like, "Sure, we can order that." And I just see what it does for people's spirits to be housed, to be in community, and to be able to live in a way that they are not used to. And I can tell you that the people that live in that place are so grateful. They say how wonderful it is. And these are people that have never been really offered much in their lives. And so to be offered a clean place that had welcome baskets and clean sheets and clothing, and there's a meal program there as well. These are the kind of infrastructure and supports that I really believe need to come together. And I just want to share lastly that, just because we had spoken about this earlier, I think about some of the planning that goes in and some of the funding. And yes, our federal government comes out with these, you know, amounts of money dedicated to, you know, housing and homelessness. But more planning needs to go behind that, because I can tell you that we needed to call emergency services to that building last week, and they needed to get up to the 3rd floor. Well, the stretcher couldn't get into the elevator. So, lots of stuff have to happen about the infrastructure pieces. And I think of the work that my adopted brother has done. He's an architect in Austin, Texas. And years ago, he was contracted to create a homeless shelter. And what he said was that what he wanted to do was talk to the people who were homeless. And he knew that. He knew it was important to do that because of what our father had experienced. And so he approached it in a very spiritual with those types of efforts and intentions. And the design of it cost way more than the city ever had planned to spend. It's called ARC. It's the Austin Resource Center for the Homeless. It's a green building. And because he engaged with people, he actually built one floor that just has a coverage. They didn't want to sleep inside. They're like, we actually like sleeping outside. This is like Texas, right? It's not like Toronto. So, he made this space where they can live and be in the way that they can be. On the ground floor, they put a medical clinic and a library and a multipurpose room. And so these are the types of systems that we really have to have for our people. We need to talk with our people to understand how to design a supportive system for them. So, Odette.
Thank you so much for that example. And I know we don't really have time to get into it, but of course, the federal government always makes promises about, housing plans and things they're going to do. And I think without meaningful consultation, it's practically useless because unless you're actually asking people what they need, this is me going off on my soapbox for a bit, you're not going to have the kind of housing that we need to really address this issue in Canada. Roberta, I was going to turn to you. You're in a unique and challenging position at Unity Health, and I wanted to ask you a little bit, as it relates to housing, how you see it impacts people's health and sort of what's being done, within your role to deal with that.
Thank you, Emily. Before I start, though, in answering your actual question, I am just so in awe and reflecting of all of our panelists that have gone so far. Each one of us up here, I think, have our own individual stories, our family stories, our own personal stories in our relation to homelessness, but also about the solutions. I'm just reminded that early in my career, I was a social worker practicing in the Indigenous community, and this is 30 plus years ago. My first job out of university was working at Native men's residence as a life skills coach. And I was shocked going into a room of 30 men surrounded and introducing myself to them and thinking, oh, what can I teach these guys about life skills? And feeling really inadequate and young. So now, 30 years later, I'm here at Unity Health Toronto. I hear from Suzanne's plenary so many themes and things that are such truths for Indigenous people. One of the biggest things I think that we've heard, and thank you very much for highlighting the work of all the research that you've been doing and all the community relationships that you've built over the years. Unity Health itself also does a lot of research around homelessness, and we do have a researcher, Dr. Stephen Huang, who's been dealing with homelessness for many, many years. And we have other researchers as well through Well Living House, Dr. Janet Smiley, that has identified through Indigenous population health all of those unmet needs that you've highlighted. I love your model that you showed earlier, getting away from focusing on those negative kind of things for those social determinants of health and kind of flipping that model around and looking at what we need. What from an Indigenous community perspective is needed. There's a number of things I think that have happened here at Unity Health which are promising. There has been a lot of pilots started up dealing in the emergency department even of getting outreach workers out into community and actually connecting people to housing. There was an ED program as well, the emergency department program, where they're addressing homelessness as well, and facilities transitions so that when people do come into the hospitals, that they get connected and have community supports. My particular office is going to be, I think, very much involved in the work that needs to be done around addressing those material unmet needs and those cultural and spiritual unmet needs that Suzanne was talking about. Because we know that our cultures are strong. There is a lot of learning, a lot of teachings there. That is what's been sustaining everybody for many, many years. We also know, though, that there is a housing crisis out there. So even if we had like 100 different workers trying to connect people to housing, there's not enough housing out there. Absolutely not enough housing out there. And we need variety of housing. I feel really proud to actually be in the room with the ED of Native Men's Residence because I started my career there. And I've seen it grow, and I've watched it grow over the years from just a small shelter with a few beds to this wonderful program that has, second stage housing and then more permanent housing for people and all the support services that go into place. But I also know that we need more. We need more than just that. We need multiple. And so this one particular program at Native Men's Residence could use an influx of funding to be able to expand the services that they offer, to have more housing out there. We could also do with a lot of other different models because there is, quite frankly, a lot of care that is needed. I think about some of the people that are currently within the hospital and the complex medical challenges that they're going to have even when they're discharged from hospital. And to have the kinds of supports in place that actually are there for people on a regular basis, on a daily basis, even when they leave the hospital. It's about connecting care, that doorway that comes from community into the hospital and back out to community again. There needs to be systems put in place to resource that, but also we need to have more housing, frankly. I too kind of was not really sure what was going on with the federal funding. I received a survey a year ago about Indigenous housing and filled it in. And they asked all sorts of questions about what the needs are and what kind of models could work. But I didn't really hear much about it, honestly. I know there's one particular program here in the city that got funded to build a new building for people that are being released from prisons. And I think that is incredibly important. But I also know that there is varied needs around housing. And I really want to support people and to think that those folks that come into the hospital, whether it's through the emergency department or through other means of care pathways, that we're actually able to connect people in a better way to sustainable housing. And that we're able to kind of look at and do the assessment of people, of their holistic life, all those things that were unmet, all those things that they need in order to be successful and to ensure that they're able to achieve their vision of what they want in their life in terms of self-determination. That's the kind of work that I can see our hospital doing. But we also need all of our partners, our community partners. We need non-Indigenous people across the country as well to understand and feel that in their heart, to understand what it means to be able to help and offer assistance. Indigenous people know what we need in order to move forward and to have a better life. And it's up to non-Indigenous community to hear that and to be able to say, how can I help you? I think at the very center of everything is that we're all human beings and we're all deserving of love, and that unconditional love is where we need to start. And we need to take a look at ourselves and see where we are and what we can do differently to become better people, to be better allies, and to be able to support. And I'm incredibly proud to be able to be part of a network that is hearing that call and is open and willing to work in partnership with Indigenous community. Miigwech.
Thank you so much for that. Lynn, you really are probably going to be our last question. And we talked a little bit, again, about this goes back to the idea of, there isn't a single model or way that Indigenous peoples or any people become homeless. There's a huge variety of factors. Obviously, systemic racism, colonialism, and oppression plays deeply into the disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples. But you and I had talked a bit about, Métis people, and I was hoping you could express specific challenges that we talked about facing that group and possible solutions.
Sure. Miigwech. I too want to thank everybody for their stories about, your families, your own lived experiences. When I was asked to be on the panel, I thought, what can I contribute? I felt a little bit like an anomaly, but we started talking about our own personal experiences, and I definitely felt anxious about speaking about homelessness because it impacted all of my family, including myself. And I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. I've been in the Toronto community since the 70s, and when my dad came from Sudbury, we lived in housing in Sudbury, and he stayed in the shelter for a little bit, and that's probably what helped him get housing in Regent Park. So I grew up in Regent Park, and it really shaped a lot of who I am. And when I think about the homelessness experiences of myself and my family and being Métis, not always looking Indigenous, perhaps, sometimes maybe, sometimes not, depending on who you're around and if it's summer and, all of those things, right? you know it, the seasonal racism, right? Because we get dark in like 2 minutes in the summertime. But I think about the stats that you talked about, right? And how Métis and non-status, and I'm so glad you're working with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, but Métis and non-status are missed in the stats, right? So your stats are actually higher. Just like Suzanne said, I didn't complete the census for many years because I didn't have stable housing. I lived in illegal housing, so you can't really complete the census when the person who received the census is housing you illegally. So I wasn't counted for a long time, and I look back on the censuses that are coming out right now, and my family's missing or named incorrectly and things like that. So with respect to half-breeds, right, we know about script without a T, and we know about the Métis mostly in the prairies, and they talk about the road allowance people. So when the reserve system was put in place, Métis or half-breeds were not included in that. And there's a lot more knowledge about script in the prairies and how Métis, half-breeds, were swindled out of land, right? But there's not a lot of conversation about Métis in Ontario and how when the, for instance, like the Huron, oops, my sound just went.
I can hear you.
No, it went in my ears. Sorry, it's just this thing that happens sometimes. So the Robinson Huron Treaty and how half-breeds were noted in there, but we had to make a decision to be, under the chief or on our own. So people chose to be on their own. My uncle lived in a trailer, on Crown land. So you can live on Crown land, if you don't know this, for 21 days, and you move your trailer, I think it's 100 meters. And that's what my family did growing up. Not my dad. We always lived in housing, in social housing. So, my uncle lived in a trailer just by Serpent River and, not receiving supports. And to this day, the family of my uncle does not have, for the most part, most of them don't have their Métis citizenship. But I think that when we talk about homelessness, I want you to really think about the people who are not getting any supports because they're not even considering getting their Métis citizenship. It's not important. Being housed is important. Today, I had a conversation online with someone from Regent Park linked me to someone else who's trying to get his status. And technically, under the Indian Act, he should have his status. And, so he can't be afforded any programs or services because he's not status. And in order to get status, he contacted the reserve, which he definitely can obtain status from, and they didn't want to have a conversation. A lot of First Nations do not want to have more members because of the funding. Yes, miigwech. Nope, you go for it. So Métis are in a similar position. So we know that, you know, two chiefs with the Robinson treaties wanted to mention half-breeds, and the government wasn't having it. So I want you to think about who's missing, who's not getting those services. You know, when I was homeless, it was shame for me. I didn't let people know. I had a master's degree. I did 1 year of my PhD, and I came back to Canada, and I couldn't get a job. And I lived in my car. I was fortunate to have a car. My sister was fortunate to have a car. It's scary to sleep in your car. And it was shame. You know, years later, I tell people, and they say, well, why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to, you know, ask someone to stay on their couch. And then with my sister Suzanne as well, like, you know, there were mental health issues there, and she's passed away. And she lived in her car for several years and stayed in the shelters during the winter, because even we're not in Texas, right? But living in a car in the winter, it's too cold. And she would go to the shelters, but she wasn't eligible for any of the special programming. So I want you to think about who's missing, right? Miigwech.
I couldn't think of a better or worse note to end on, or to say that I'm so incredibly grateful to all of the panelists for everything you said and for pointing out how little we know and how much there is to do, and all of our collective responsibility. And I say us, I say non-Native or settler Canadians in solving this problem in the short and long term. Now my only other role is to, welcome Lou Odette up. His foundation has made this whole lecture series possible, and I will turn it over to him. Thank you all so, so much.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Lou Odette. I head up the P&L Odette Foundation. And so I think my job is to wrap up tonight. It's hard act to follow, but I just wanted to say the intention of this lecture was really to have a public meeting where we brought in an expert on the topic who had done a lot of deep thinking and hard work on the challenges of homelessness, and have them share their results and their ideas, and then have a public discussion on this. So that's the idea. I do want to give my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Stewart for sharing your story today and for your tremendous research. I'd like to thank Emily Mathieu for, again, moderating tonight. Pardon? Your pleasure, and four times. Now that's a lot. I'd like to thank our panelists too for sharing your stories and giving us your time tonight. And thank you to everyone who's attended and who's joined us online. This has been a tremendous evening. Thank you very much.